It's Dina Doll, and you're watching Unprecedented. Co-host Michael Popak isn't here this week. He'll be back next, but there's still a lot to unpack, so we didn't want to skip this week. Supreme Court is not yet back in session, but they've been making some decisions. We have a decision regarding the NIH funding that Trump tried to cancel. We also have a request from South Carolina to the Supreme Court's shadow docket regarding transgender rights. And lastly, let's talk about Trump's executive order regarding flag burning. What exactly has the Supreme Court said, and how likely is it that they're going to stick to that precedent? So let's start with the shadow docket request. As we know, the shadow docket has been very busy, and we've talked about on this show how it's not very transparent. In fact, Justice Kagan spoke this summer about the fact that the Supreme Court should be more transparent and vocal regarding the shadow docket. Shadow docket is a request and a decision that the Supreme Court makes, and they don't do it in any kind of written opinion. It's a grant or dismissal. We don't hear oral arguments. We don't get the reasoning behind the judges. And unfortunately, we're getting more and more of those decisions. Even according to Justice Kavanaugh, it's creating an internal divide at the Supreme Court. Well, the latest request of the shadow docket has to do with transgender rights. You get the feeling, if you've been watching us, that opponents to any LGBTQ rights see this Supreme Court as an opportunity. We already had the request to take another look at same-sex marriage and asking the Supreme Court to overturn that. We saw with Scarametti, the decision they made this term, where the Supreme Court allowed Tennessee to ban non-surgical hormone medicine that parents tried to get with doctors for their children who were trying to transition. Now this has to do with bathrooms. Very popular hot button topic for Republicans. Specifically, South Carolina trying to ban a transgender boy from using a boys' bathroom at a public school. The appellate court there said that they did have to allow the child to use the bathroom in accordance with the law. South Carolina is asking the Supreme Court to step in and overturn that. Like I've said, people are asking the Supreme Court to expand the restrictions on same-sex transgender rights. So whether or not the Supreme Court steps in and overturns that, or in fact takes this whole case and decides whether or not to further limits the rights of trans people in this country will remain to be seen, and we will update it. Then we also have the NIH funding. So with the case with the NIH funding, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 with Chief Justice Roberts in with the typical liberal. Usually lately, it's been the three of them dissenting. Well, Chief Justice Roberts joined the liberals in the dissent here in his attempt probably to make himself seem not so partisan. But here it was also completely ineffectual because the majority was able to allow the Trump cuts of nearly $800 million to NIH to go through. They basically lifted the pause of the lower court ruling. At the same time, Justice Barrett wrote a concurring opinion saying that basically they filed in the wrong court, and to make a note of the fact that the Supreme Court, although allowing the pause, let's say, of the cut to undo, to make it clear that the guidelines were probably unlawful. The practical effect of this may be that the Supreme Court, at the end of the day, will decide that Trump's slashing of the NIH is unlawful, especially since Justice Barrett made a point of saying this was a jurisdictional issue on her part and not a substantive decision. However, in the meantime, plaintiffs in that case are saying the reality for science is the uncertainty of whether or not they're going to get funding at all, and the years that it will take for this litigation to get to court in of itself will hurt science. Lastly, we have the decision, or the executive order, let's say, regarding burning of the flags. As we know, Trump has decided that he can remake the Constitution by executive order. He's done it with birthright citizenship. He now is trying to do it with flag burning. All of these decisions have yet really to go in front of the Supreme Court. As we know, birthright citizenship, the actual substantive question of whether or not Trump's executive order is legal, hasn't yet gone to the Supreme Court. However, flag burning, Trump is still going to try this. So Just so you have a little bit of information on what the precedent, the existing law on flag burning is. It's a 1989 decision, Texas v. Johnson. What it was a protester with the 1984 Republican National Convention was protesting Ronald Reagan's policies and burned a flag. Texas tried to prosecute him, saying that he was in violation of the state law that said that you cannot desecrate a venerable object in the state of Texas, and that he did so because the flag was such. Well, the Supreme Court sided with the protester and said that it was free speech, a demonstration of speech, and so was therefore constitutionally protected. This was a 5-4 decision. Interestingly, Justice Scalia voted in favor of this being free speech, just to show how far the Supreme Court has gone. Justice Scalia, as we know, has always been a very conservative judge, but perhaps this means that Justice Alito or Justice Thomas or Justice Gorsuch, who idolize Justice Scalia, may not be willing to give Trump what he wants on this. And what does Trump want on this? Well, his executive order, specifically in a way to try to get around the Constitution, let's say, tries to say that he is outlawing the flag burning and saying it's not protected free speech, but instead should not be lawful because it incites violence. Now, the free speech always has a carve out for speech that incites violence. You can't scream. An example you always hear from lawyers is you can't scream fire in a crowded theater because you can create mayhem. You can create a mob. You can create an unsafe environment for people. So you can have speech, but it cannot be speech that incites violence. And Trump is trying to say that burning the flag incites violence. The state crime in Texas was more about the fact that it offended people. This is going to be his argument if he does indeed, or the DOJ tries to prosecute somebody under his executive order. He's going to try to say that it incites violence, and that is why it's a carve out to free speech. But in order for them to prove it, the flag burning has to actually be done in a way to seem to intentionally incite violence, or does in fact incite violence. So those of you who are out protesting, if this happens, we may want to look for bad actors that doesn't create a situation that the DOJ then uses as evidence. But that's something, of course, to keep to look forward. What I want to know is whether or not the next Democratic president is willing to do an executive order banning assault rifles, because school shooting after school shooting, nothing gets done. And if Trump and MAGA and the Republicans think that amending a constitution by executive order is fine, well, maybe we should do the same thing and ban assault rifles. We have a major update regarding the Voting Rights Act in front of the Supreme Court. As we know, Louisiana is the state in front of the Supreme Court defending the redistricting maps that they put in place, because after the census, they drew one majority Black district, despite the fact that a third of their voters were Black. They then added a second congressional district when they lost in court over the fact that they were diluting Black voting rights. And during this last term, when this case was in front of the Supreme Court, Louisiana was arguing to the Supreme Court that this was done not in any race-based way, but in fact, they were trying to keep the political advantage of Speaker Mike Johnson. Well, now, as we know, the Supreme Court went back and asked the parties to answer the one simple question of whether or not Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, whether or not it in fact violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which requires equal protection of the law and disallows racial discrimination. Well, Louisiana just filed a filing with the Supreme Court where they answered that yes, in fact, their map did violate the Constitution. So they are, in effect, completely changing the position that they took during oral arguments, where they were then trying to defend their congressional map. They were actually asking the Supreme Court to give them some leniency, to say, we are trying to comply with both the Voting Rights Act in a way to not violate the Constitution, basically give us some grace on this. Now Louisiana is saying, well, I'm glad you asked that question, the Supreme Court, and your answer is yes. Basically declare the fact that we did this second congressional district, please declare it unconstitutional. So now in effect, you have both named parties in this case, both agreeing that the Louisiana second drawn district is unconstitutional. Of course, we still have the Black voters asking the Supreme Court to uphold that second congressional district as constitutional. But this is basically a complete 360 that Louisiana took. Not surprising. It was a little bit strange for Louisiana to be in that position, considering how Republican that state was. And during oral arguments, you could kind of hear it in their lawyers that they didn't maybe feel as strongly about defending that second congressional district as they did, but they were defending it. Now in this filing, they're not. They're asking the Supreme Court to declare their own actions unconstitutional. Either way, we are going to be back next week with a full unprecedented show, but just to keep you in the loop, because there are so many issues that come down the pike here with the Supreme Court, we didn't want you to miss out.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.